Welcome to the data journey. Today we're going to be talking about connecting data threads with Ben Peterson of Premier Needle Arts. A little bit of background on Ben. He is the Director of Digital Marketing and Data Analytics at Premier Needle Arts, which I'll explain is a brand of brands. But Ben's path intersected with mine initially at the University of Utah when he was a student there and I was an adjunct professor teaching as a graduate student. And then through time, you have become one of my most cherished colleagues. I got to experience what it's like, I think, to be a faculty member and groom individuals into the field of expertise a little, and then watch them surpass you in many ways. And that's really what I've seen with Ben. So I'm excited to have him here today to talk about how Premier Needle Arts has made progress in their data journey, because Ben, you had a very unique situation. I've heard lots of these stories, and your situation is unique in a couple of ways. One, the fact that it is a brand of brands. Usually when someone's being brought on to help with data, there's one entity. That entity has all of the different data silos. Instead, you had multiple entities with all of those multiple data silos. So that was one of the things that made your story unique. The other is that your proximity to leadership and your role there, I believe, has allowed them to make progress at a pace that is far faster than things we typically see. So I'm excited to dig into your story. If people have questions, they can reach out to Ben after this. But today's discussion flow is going to focus first on the data problem. I mentioned already that P&A is a brand of brands. So their problem was magnified. They had data sprawl, not just within organizations, but across organizations. So accessing trustworthy insights was both manual and very, very slow, if possible at all. The solution to this problem was a single source of truth, which we called the data ecosystem in the initial build. This was the best tech stack given the both technological limits and the budgetary limits. And we can talk about how we went down one path for many months that resulted in a dead end, and then had to back up, start over, take the lessons learned, and progress forward into the final form of what was stood up in version 1. And then we'll talk about the next steps, where you're going with your data at P&A, because at present, you have, I think, over 80 dashboards. You've now incorporated predictive models into production. You have lots of users, and those users are creating their own dashboards from Power BI reports. You have data on-ramps. So you've got a really robust system that you have built in these 3 years. Is it 3 or 4? We're going into the 4th year now.
Yeah, I mean, we started the second half of 2019. So it's been a minute at this point, 3.5, 4 years.
Well, let's go right into the problem that you faced at that point in 2019. I remember you calling, and you had been pricing out at that point different systems and solutions. You've been looking for something, you'd been tasked, and that's where I came in. So why don't you back up, tell me a little bit of the story that led up to that, and then we can pick up where we started collaborating.
Yeah, I mean, when I got involved with Premier Needle Arts, they were doing with their data what I think most organizations do, which is that they have the accounting team, and the accounting team runs extra reports for them and whatnot, and puts it all together. The issue is it's very labor intensive, and then your accountants aren't closing the monthly accounts. They're not posting to the GLs. They're building reports for different people. So really there was a need to have a broader range of visibility that was more accessible. And I was in a unique position, like you said, where I was working directly under the CEO, and kind of just posed this problem, challenge, opportunity, however you want to look at it, of, hey, we need this visibility. And, having worked with dashboarding in the past, having worked with you in the past, I had a rough idea of, directionally where we could go. And I knew that, we needed some sort of data warehousing solution, some sort of aggregation as a source of truth in order for us to be able to build reliable reporting. So that's where this all started. It was really, hey, we just have the basic typical business reporting. It's all coming from accountants. We need them to do accounting, not reporting, which is a weird concept that some people might think about. But so, yeah, I mean, that's really where it started. And then we started reaching out to companies at the time. And I don't know the exact source on this, but there was a recent study, and this was recent for them. So 2018, 2019 stats have potentially changed from that point. they'd done a study where 80% of data initiatives and data programs had failed. And this is across large organizations, not just small organizations. Um, and so really it was just a unique challenge. And, that's why I ended up reaching out to you. We also reached out to another company that came in quite a bit more expensive and ultimately didn't seem the right cultural fit. So that's where we decided to team up with you guys.
So backing up to the data sprawl, how many different sources of data as you got into each of these brands? How many distinct sources of data were there? And then how much of an overlap was there from brand to brand?
Yeah, so talking about the brand of brands, so we're a private equity company, which means that we've gone out and acquired all of the different brands or companies that are underneath us. So every one of these brands represented its own distinct company, and that company has an ERP. They have different, social media sites, platforms, tools, ad hoc reports, spreadsheets, etc., that are unique to each of them because they were their own business. So when you're talking about, okay, we have all these distinct businesses or brand, individual brands, and we're trying to pull them into this family of like, now we're one business, it becomes extremely complex. So when we had started this, the initial data interviews that we did, I mean, I think we were less than 10 total data sources. I think that they were like, oh yeah, we got some spreadsheets here and we got like one or two main databases and that's it. Um, And then just as we started getting into it, right, I mean, it was just multiplied by every business where I was like, well, these three brands already share an ERP, but they all have their own distinct website servers. They have, distinct social media tools and logins. They have their own way of reporting about things. Then obviously the various ERPs for the other brands that we had to dig into and figure out, okay, like where does this data live? There was some data that was in the cloud, some data that was on hard, like, actual physical servers on premises. So when we finished, I think we're, well over 25 data sources that, ultimately had to go into this when the initial thought was like, oh, this could be like five, 5 to 7 sources should be slam dunk. Turned out to not be the case. So
So why did you in the end decide to build your own system instead of buying or more appropriately renting access to a system? There are existing providers that you mentioned. I don't know what the other providers that you looked at were. I don't know if they were a buy or a rent solution, but in the end, you decided to buy.
yeah, I mean, ultimately, there are more companies now that do a better job, that are doing, maybe not the exact same thing, but are a little bit better now than they were back then. But a big emphasis for us was ownership over the data, right? So a lot of times when you're going through an external company, there's a couple of really big ones where basically they're like, hey, we own this, and then we'll build reports for you, and then that's how it operates. And that's for us is not was not a good model. It was extremely expensive, way more expensive to go that route. Um, and B, it's like, hey, if we cut our relationship, what happens to the data that we're feeding into your system? And they're like, well, they can say if they're going to delete it or not. But the fact is, it's on their own hard drive on their servers, and if they decide to keep it, like, there's nothing we can do to that would be able to stop them from doing that. Um, So really, I mean, it came down to a couple of factors, which was the ownership portion of it, but also just the cost of doing it. I mean, most companies are spending, 500,000 to $1 million just in the launch year alone of trying to launch a data program. And a lot of that's not necessarily just the sunk cost in the systems, which a big chunk of it is, but the other part of that is that companies feel like they have to have, I have to have a data scientist and a project manager and a database engineer, et cetera, et cetera. And they end up this team of 5 to 6 people that is costing them, $400,000 a year in salaries or more at this point. Um, when it just doesn't make sense. So the approach for us was really to just go at this from a different angle, look at it from a cost standpoint, um, and make sure that we were able to do this where we had ownership over the whole process, we had ownership over costs. And to do that, really the best solution was to build something with outside help. And that's where obviously reaching out to you guys was the major step, was that you guys were providing that outside help. So we didn't have to hire 15 people internally to run this.
Okay. You mentioned the stat of 80% of data projects fail. I've seen that stat repeated at 85. From what I can tell, the original post that spread this fact around has been retracted on Twitter long ago. And I believe it was Gartner that had put something out. But if you look around, the majority of projects are definitely failing. I don't know if it's 80% anymore. I think maybe people are getting a little bit better as the technology is maturing, as processes are being codified and approaches are being tested and validated. But I would say that still the vast majority, 60% plus, maybe up to 80%, it would fit with the Pareto principle of these projects are failing. Yours succeeded. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of factors that go into the success. So one that I think is extremely underrated just across any organization is that data people tend to be very black and white. And I'm the same way. I'm a very black and white person. Um, so this was something that was personally difficult for me navigating this situation. But there are politics in business, and whether or not you want to say that politics should or shouldn't belong in business is, I think, irrelevant to the fact that it does exist in a business environment. And so there are a lot of people that for whatever reason, they hear data, they hear reporting, and in their mind they hear big brother, oversight, extra work, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a big component of it where, you have different responses from leaders. You have people that outwardly are all for it because they know that management is for it, but they will never actually use it. They won't, want to use it, and they won't work with you in order to make something work. You have other people that will be outright hostile towards it, where they just don't want to do it. And some of that is insecurity about, jobs and things like that, where if somebody's building a report and building that report takes up 4 or 5 hours of a day every week, you take that away from them and they're like, well, what is my job? Like, are they going to relegate me? Are they going to demote me? Are they going to move me or get rid of me? Right. So the political aspect, I think, is extremely undervalued when people are looking at these programs of like, what is the effect this is going to have on our team generally, and not just individual team members, but managers who will try to sabotage this program. And the other component of success that helped me a lot with navigating that was the fact that I was reporting directly to the CEO, and it was sponsored by the CEO. Um, and the CEO at the time is somebody who is extremely well versed in people, very good at connecting with people, and interacting in a business environment. So me, who's a very black and white person, going in saying, "Hey, this will be better for you and your job," and that person, internally is like, "No, it's not, and I'm not going to help you. I'm going to tell you I'm going to help you so I don't get in trouble, but I'm not going to help you." Right? Being able to take that to a sponsor who had the ultimate authority in the business, who also had personal experience being able to navigate this, played a massive role in us being able to be successful. Because the hardest part is not building data. Like, anyone can set up a server and push data into a server. The difficult part is the next step of, okay, how is this data being used and by who, and how does it really affect their job? And one of the things I always like to say is that, we hired you to do a specific job, and so us providing dashboards and reports for you, like, allows you to do the thing we hired you to do. So, a lot of people still, I mean, I don't know what it is, but there's just a lot of insecurity about data.
So sabotage, self-sabotage is what you're attributing most of the failure to, just the fear of change. And there are, by the way, there are some organizations that are not as welcoming of new things and even mistakes as Premier Needle Arts. It's been one of the exceptional things about you as we've worked with you for the last few years. You really do have a team that considers each other a very close knit group. Um, so maybe you were able to avoid some of that self sabotage just because of that culture. There are other cultures where any mistake is a leads to such strict and awful consequences that people just hide it. That the best plan of action, the rational thing to do, is to hide it. And we've definitely seen both of those environments. I think you're right that you're on something here, that the culture goes a long way to supporting what should be a launching pad for everyone to be able to do the thing that, like you said, they're hired to do, which usually is also the thing they like to do. Most
Right.
people do not like to spend hours a day in Excel, or even the more likely pattern that we see is a couple hours a week, a couple hours a month, a couple hours a quarter, and then a week every year. It's like being in the National Guard.
Hmm.
They're just doing this as a side hustle to their job to make their job function. All of it is about demonstrating what they've done up the chain, usually, which
Yeah.
that's so easy to automate. And I think you're right. That mental switch that people have to make around once they, and I've seen this in person with people when we've revealed dashboards, when they start to realize I'm never going to have to do that again in Excel, I can just go do my job. Their attitudes do change very quickly. But whether the culture can support that is a good point.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
you mentioned some data. I want to talk about this data real fast before we continue, because you were also one of the early adopters. So it was not just that you were going different routes, and we'll talk about some other ways that you went different routes with some of what you've done. But you did this very early relative to a lot of the other organizations. As of 2021, the Wisdom of the Crowd's business intelligence market study stated that 80% of enterprises are currently using BI tools, which means 20%, 1 in 5 of enterprises, is not using any kind of BI tool. Gartner found something similar as a pattern among small and medium sized businesses, that 50% of them were not using any sort of advanced analytics or BI tools. And the C-Sense, they're a dashboard maker, annual data and analytics report found that 54% of companies worldwide have increased the adoption of BI tools since 2020, but 50%, 46% have not. So you see this very bifurcated situation where the enterprises are moving faster than the SMBs. But overall, there are two groups: those who have embraced this and are starting to move forward, and those that have just dug in their feet. And I don't know what their long term plan is. What do you think is going to happen in that situation? Having seen the way that data has transformed Premier Needle Arts, where you came in and the data was so
Hmm.
disparate, for those who are sitting on their hands, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question to contemplate. The reality is, I think in the small business world, the reality is that if you're a good business operator, um, there is a window of opportunity where you really don't need power, like you don't need BI tools, you don't need to be doing advanced analytics. If you're a small business, you're doing less than $15 million a year, and it's somewhere between 10 and $15 million that you start really needing to use analytics. But up to that point, you can really manage a business with your basic accounting reports and just making sure, like, am I making more money than I'm spending, right? So there's for like really small businesses, especially like in-person businesses, this is, not e-commerce, but like if you're running a store, you're in the store every day, you can get a feel for that. Like you don't really need advanced analytics. However, once you're online, once you're heavily engrossed in e-commerce, and especially if you're at a point where you're like, hey, we've been sitting at 8, $9 million for the last 5, 10 years. We'd really like to be at $20 million. You absolutely have to have adoption. So for me, it incorporating analytics is less of a will you fail or will you succeed. I think it's more of it limits you to how far you can go as an organization without introducing the efficiencies and visibility that reporting allows you. Because really beyond that 10 to $15 million point, that's when you really need to start delegating. And when you start delegating, right, that's where having an automated report is super helpful because you can keep a pulse on the business without needing to be personally involved in every step.
And as a homage to our data overlords, this information was aggregated via ChatGPT. If you want to recreate this yourself, the exact prompt was, what data exists on the number of businesses globally and then only within the US that have not adopted some kind of business intelligence platform? Well, let's talk about your solution. We talked about the problem and the problem as it's facing the rest of the market and other competitors, some of which, thanks to your system, you were able to masterly outmaneuver during the pandemic. And we'll get to that coming up here in a bit. But let's talk about overall high level abstract. The solution that you have stood up at this point is a Dockerized deployment that uses multiple databases. So this visual is not exact to your system because we didn't want to. This is an abstract of the way that these systems are typically being set up by us and the way that Nexum works, which is a Dockerized container on cloud resources. That's actually a distinction. You have stayed on premise. And I want to come back to that because I think that the same argument that you made around cost savings has proven out in your case to be true compared to going to the cloud, which is why your deployment is on premise. But whether it's on premise or it's in the cloud, that Dockerized environment is going to stand itself up, use a config file to then connect to all of the various data sources. Some of these are in-house. You have multiple in-house servers. You have different software that you have connection to, database connection to. And when I say in-house, some of that's in your Eastern Coast organizations. Some are on the West Coast organizations. Some are in Salt Lake City. So you are physically connecting into servers across the country. You're also pulling in data from all of your shipping partners, which is a big component of your business model. But your social platforms, there's some other selling tools, I think, that are in there. You mentioned at one point that it was a 50 plus of these different connections. All that data is brought in, transformed, prepped, and then staged so that the rest of the organization can connect in through Power BI. Is that correct? So I'm describing at the highest level, I'm describing the way that your ecosystem currently works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and kind of going back to your first part, or your first part of the question, right? Is like, what did we do differently? And this is an instance where I think we can kind of rail against the ivory tower a little bit, where the whole data ecosystem ideology thought process was developed by very smart computer scientists, primarily at universities, who set up like an ideal system state. The problem is that in the real world, in order for us to take perfect documentation of all of our source servers, push all of that data, so not just like part of the data, but the true way to do it is to push all of the data from all sources, regardless if the data is useful or not, just push everything into one massive server and then set up a second server, right? So the first server is your data lake. Then you set up another server that's your data warehouse. And then you push just the things you want and do the transfer of information that you want from your data lake into your data warehouse. And then from your data warehouse, you then connect that and build that into dashboards and make some additional adjustments on the dashboard side. In an ideal system state, I agree that is the perfect way to do it. The problem is that if you have a lot of data pushing into a data lake, first off, your data lake is going to exponentially increase in price because you're basically paying to have duplicates of all of this data and all of your servers when duplicates and data, like duplicates of your server, already exist as backups in case of emergency. So really, this is a third complete copy of your data that just increases your total data load. And if you especially are on the cloud, that's extremely expensive to do. The next part is that they would ideally like you to spend a ton of time doing your transformations from your lake to another server you would need to set up in your data warehouse. And again, this is the ideal situation, right? So you're making these transformations. The issue is that you don't know how these transformations are going to affect your end result reporting. Also, if you need to make changes on the end result reporting, then you have to go back and you have to look at this interaction between your data lake and your data warehouse and you have to make adjustments in those transformations. So you lose a lot of flexibility because you need somebody who has a lot of experience working in that database to database world of making transformations to do a lot of that work. So that's the ideal situation that, if you, you look up documentation online, it's all going to follow very similar flows to that. Some are more complicated, some are less complicated. Where we went differently is that we recognized, look, we don't need every piece of useless data flowing into our data lake environment. So what we did is we were like, okay, what are the actual like pieces of information from these sources that we need? And we push that into our server. And then we sorted that by brand. So there was a little bit of sorting in it. But for the most part, right, we didn't feel the need to spend thousands and thousands of dollars a month paying for space on a server that was just housing information that was, a log of things that is irrelevant to the business or the reporting we're trying to build. So that's the first thing we did to cut down on cost and to cut, ahead of where we would have otherwise been. The next thing is that instead of setting up um, a second server as our data warehouse, what we did is that we used Power BI, and in Power BI, um, you have the transform and load, and people familiar with Excel Power Query, it's similar to that. There is a little bit more functionality, I think, than Power Query, but principally it's the same thing. And what we did is we made the back end of every Power BI report basically its own little data warehouse where it was pulling information from this data lake, combined, hybridized data lake version that we built. And we were building the data warehouse on the back end of the Power BI report. What that allowed us to do is that we had a ton of flexibility. If we needed to change anything, we didn't need someone that was technically advanced in servers, or we didn't need to hire anyone specialized in that to make those transformations. We could just do that all on the back end of Power BI. And so that allowed us to very quickly go from aggregating the most important information to outputting accessible reports within the organization that were immediately useful to people. And it also helped leadership see immediate results of reporting, which if you go the traditional route, I mean, you're months and months, even in some cases, year plus of there being no reporting, no visual output to business leaders for them to actually be able to see progress with your data program that you're building. So that's what we did in the initial phase that gave us a ton of cost saving and a ton of flexibility looking at, how do we show success quickly? And that quick success was here's dashboards that are stood up and accurate, within months instead of a year plus.
Yeah, there is a very bad tendency to do it perfect from the first iteration. And I think that's also contributing to a lot of the failure. So for those enterprises and those SMBs who are embracing these tools, the idea that you would have a surgical solution instead of this giant ecosystem that is perfect in form, there's two very different types of approaches here. And the dominant form is the one that you said, which is you got to have a data lake. I agree with you. Most of the time you do not. You have to have, data warehouses and data marts. And once you start to overly complicate the system, you also increase the requirements for supporting that system. So as this system will inevitably grow, the version that you create from V1 onward is going to adopt and or adapt, I guess is the real term I'm looking for. This is why the term ecosystem invokes that living organic aspect, but also the interconnectivity. The bigger it gets, the more connected it is, the harder it is to maintain. And suddenly you do end up with a whole staff supporting this system, which is moving a lot of data that may not be useful, may never be useful, probably isn't going to ever even get referenced, and might be coming from sources that you've since moved on from, but you're still keeping the data there. So I'm with you there, but let me make the counter argument. Isn't it better though to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it?
Well, I mean, you still have it in all of the sources.
Right. Mm.
So, I mean, it's
Yeah,
not like you don't have it. I'm just
but
not
you are
paying
back to the
to
same,
rehost it.
but you do have the same concern that you had earlier to some degree, which is what if FedEx cuts you off?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real concern or question. But my counter argument to that is that, like, at a certain point, you're gonna have all critical information flowing in there, and if they cut you off, you have that historical record in your data warehouse up to that point of when you were cut off. So, and then after you're cut off, I mean, you can't get the data anyway, so it's not like, it's not like you're missing out on something. They've stopped you from being able to have that data. So, um, yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that there are some, I could say, fears in that regard. However, the practical experience is that, once you're setting this up, you're going department by department, you're collecting the key pieces of information that you need to have in order for them to be successful and in order for them to have meaningful reporting. If you get cut off at some point, then it's not like you can keep making dashboards or reporting on that information in the future anyway. So, what you have in your data warehouse is going to be the best information you can get.
There's two things on this visual that I want to come back to in a minute. The first is the machine learning module that's there, but faded out a little because that is a piece that's uh, currently ongoing. You've got a lot of different predictive models that I want to come back and talk about. Some very interesting stuff that you've done, especially around using macroeconomic data, because I want to talk about that data variety. But I also want to come back to this idea again around useful or not in the approach of a data lake versus this much more surgical 100-day deployment. Get the most important parts up, get 5 dashboards in front of the entire company, make sure that they're all aligned on those metrics. You get the common definition of those metrics from the beginning. That's another benefit. The other thing about a data lake is you let people start to access things and you get multiple versions of the same metric being utilized all across the organization. They don't always align. They don't always agree. And from there, you build out the frontier of the rest of this ecosystem as is needed, rather than say, this is all of our domain, everything inside of it, and we're going to guard all of it and use all of it. It's just not practical. So I agree with you, but I do want to come back and talk about the variety issue of data and then the machine learning models, because those are related. Well, this gets to what I think is probably the most interesting part of your story, both as an economist, because I love to find counter-cyclical examples in the economy. And for those who don't know what a counter-cyclical example is, it is a business that will either do just as well or boom, even boom, during a time of other economic downturn. So the cause of the economic downturn is not necessarily the key defining point. So it's not as though a pandemic is the reason. It could just be that there's a recession. It could be that there's a credit crisis. It could be that there's an import issue. It could be that everybody's stuff is stuck on containerized ships off of the West Coast for a little while. Whatever the reason, there's economic disruption. Some businesses implode immediately. And we were talking to a different company around the same time who had a very different outcome as a result of the pandemic. And I think some of that is a result of the market that you serve, the community that your businesses all align around, which are crafting individuals. So we didn't really hit on this at the beginning when we said that P&A is this brand of brands, but all the brands that are owned by P&A are specific to the crafting industry, correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's correct.
So I think that had some of the caused some of the outcomes that we're talking about today. It had a lot, maybe even to do with the fact that during the pandemic, your business boomed. The second part of it, and this is, I don't think, just correlation, is that in March of 2020, we stood up this system. So
Right.
back, you were talking about when you asked for our help, it was in about May, I think, of 2019. You said mid-year. Fast forward almost a year later, when this project is finally done and the dashboards are deployed, it was very early in March of 2020. Walk us through what happened then and how you use this system.
Yeah, I mean, I think we reacted like any company did. It's okay, where the world is shutting down, and we're gonna put some people, we didn't lay anyone off, but we did, kind of like some rolling things where we're, putting people that, telling people that, not to come in or helping them apply for government benefits, um, and then welcoming them back, after a period of time just to help us mitigate costs and do some of those things. So I think we navigated it, and this isn't a credit to me, this is credit to the management team at that time. We navigated it very well from a mitigating costs using the tools that were available in the economy, et cetera. Where we received kind of the benefit of data is that now that the system had been set up, we had built a lot of reporting that was looking at, like, hey, what's our incoming daily orders? What is like our total average days to ship? How many packages per day are we shipping? Those kind of numbers. And we at our warehouse in Ohio, at our distribution center, we had told everyone, okay, hey guys, go home. And we were expecting, a business downturn. But the benefit of this reporting is that, it was clear almost immediately after maybe a week and a half that our our orders per day was shooting through the roof, and our outgoing orders per day was zero. So all of a sudden, after 2 weeks, we're sitting there, we're like, holy crap, we're sitting on, $6 to $8 million of orders that need to go out, and we haven't been able to ship in 2 weeks. Um, so just being able to have that in a clear format that clearly outlined the picture of what was actually happening relative to our business, allowed us to, instead of saying, hey, we're just going to have to, whatever the number's going to be, it's going to be, and we're going to have to come back to this when we can come back. It allowed us to take an immediate approach of like, hey, we got to reach out to the local government in Ohio. We got to figure out like what is deemed a needed employee. Like how do we start working within the parameters of the state and within the parameters of the guidelines to get people back to work, to get back to shipping. And it wasn't in full at first, but at least having that information there allowed us to really understand the magnitude of what we were sitting on. I believe, had we gone a month or month and a half before we had finally come back and started trying to ship again, we would have been buried by, 12 to $15 million in orders. And I don't know if that's something that we would have been able to, um, been able to still ship and receive the revenue on, because we've been sitting on it for so long. People will most likely cancel their orders at some point. But B, just the total load was already so immense on that team when they came back. I cannot imagine, had we made that go any further, what they would have been walking into. It would have been, a D-Day for them in the literal sense of like, hey guys, you're working, 24/7 for the next 6 months to catch up. So I think that was really the benefit of, we had this data, we had it set up, and we had quick visibility and allowed us to react within weeks, where other companies and other organizations was taking them months to make the same adjustment.
What has been the hardest lesson that you've learned to this point? So you're 4 years into your data journey. You have made progress. I blasted past through this at the beginning as well. I'm realizing there's a link in one of the earlier slides to a detailed explanation about the data maturity model and the data, how you can break the data journey into chunks, and how those chunks are tied around what you can or can't do. So one of the earliest indicators is human reporting. If everything is on human reporting, then you are in a very reactive state. When you move to real-time insights that are built on a data ecosystem with dashboards, even with some predictive models, but things are being served up on a regular basis. Now you're moving to proactivity. You've now progressed to the third phase where you're doing a lot of predictive modeling, including using data that's not in-house to your own systems. You're blending it with other data from your own systems, but you're using external data sources to do some predictive modeling. You're now moving into that predictive phase. All of that can be explained if you want to go through those data maturity slides that are linked earlier in the presentation. How, at this point where you're at, what has been the hardest lesson that you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the hardest lesson learned, and it's not necessarily learned by me, I would say it's like an organizational learning, um, is really understanding how much work goes into getting a system to the point where you can start to make prescriptive or predictive analysis available. I mean, everything is mostly centered on, for the first several years, just being able to describe your data clearly and agreeing on definitions of data and cleaning up data inputs. I mean, there were a lot of time that was spent being like, hey, they've asked me to build this report. Okay, well, customer service isn't entering this information in a way that can be easily digested, right? We're not going to, especially at the time, right? Like, we're not going to pay to have, an AI model or an individual go through and have to figure out all of this, misspellings and clean things up and cover, unique entries and et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the stuff was saying like, okay, hey, we've identified this problem in how we're inputting information into our system and into our servers. From this day forward, we're putting in a new process in place for people to enter data in a way that is clearly digestible. So, you're sitting, I mean, you have to wait several months in order to get actionable data from that. And to this day, I mean, no matter how far down the pathway and the journey you go, you will still constantly find entry issues. I mean, we had one column of data in one of our tables that had four different functions, and those four different functions were completely distinct from each other, but they could override each other. So people are like, give me an accurate number on this specific thing. And I'm like, I would love to do that, except for the fact that if somebody made some sort of comment or did something, some other unique action, I just lost the fact that that other action had taken place. So that, I think, is the the hardest part organizationally, especially from a leadership standpoint, a board standpoint, where they're like, hey, we want to be predicting stuff. Like, we want you doing predictive analysis. We want you doing like super advanced pricing modeling, et cetera. And you have to go back to them and be like, look, like, we'd love to do that. We would really love to do that, except for the fact that we have to spend a ton of time just getting to the point where we can just describe cleanly the data that we're looking at. And you're talking, probably years, um, in order for that to happen across an entire organization. It can happen quicker if you're looking at like a specific function of the business, right? Like, if you really spend a lot of time in one area that's important and get that cleaned up and get it, the description stuff, you can move on to the predictive stuff and the modeling more quickly. But organizationally, you just have to understand, if you're an enterprise or a business, you're not just going to be able to start building predictive modeling and advanced modules that are doing all of these great fancy things that we want to do with data. It's just not feasible right from the beginning, and you shouldn't believe that it's feasible right from the beginning either.
It is a very good marketing tactic, though. It does seem to work quite well. You just say AI, AI, generative AI,
Yeah.
and
Well,
clean the
at the
data with
time it
AI.
was machine learning, machine learning, machine learning. Now it's AI.
I've been at this
But yeah,
long enough that it started with big data. It's just like, you got such, so the data's so big you can't open it in Excel anymore. And people are like, oh, that is a problem. Yeah,
yeah.
the problems change over time, so I'm sure you're going to face some new issues. I like the idea of the analogy of the cleanup. I liken it in the ecosystem analogy to an oil spill. This is not something you can just leave. Like, you've discovered it, now you have to clean it up. You can't just leave it there. It's going to ruin everything else. And there are a lot of oil spills upstream from everything that you're connecting to. A lot of it is about human entry, but talk to me a little bit about another pain point I know that you've gone through, which is the ever changing landscape of API connections.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's and this even just speaks back to like, why build instead of buy. Um, there's a lot of companies out there that are trying to be like, oh, you just join our platform and then we automatically create all of the API connections automatically for you, and then we do everything for you, and it's this magic black box, and it's super great. But the reality is that, you know, Google, um, especially, deprecates APIs all the time, especially over the last couple of years. Like, Google, even moving into GA4, like, anyone involved with the space, right, will you know what's going on with Google is just massive change all the time, decrementing APIs, changing APIs. And the reality is that if you don't have a system that's flexible enough and working with a partner that's flexible enough to go in there and actually make an adjustment to an API or completely rewrite an API, you're looking at massive downtime in order to get data and information into the system. Um, the other part of being able to be more flexible that's nice is that sometimes people won't decrement an API, but they'll decrement the function within the API. Another thing that we've, a good example of, again, is Google, where they're like, you go to their different API service tool where you can see like what pieces of data can I get, and it will tell you like, oh yeah, you can get these two columns of information together. And then you try to do it in their API and you can't get it, and there's no documentation about it, but Google has now stopped anyone from being able to access those two pieces of information together. So you absolutely need flexibility around like what are your sources, where is the data coming from, and how accessible is it for us to be able to update that API. If you go through a much more, kind of like venture capital plug and play type of thing, you have to wait for them to fix that. Whereas if you're building something that's on your own system and you have dev support, right, like you can immediately address like, hey, this information is no longer coming through into our database. Hey, can you figure out why, and can we fix this? And you go from, potentially months of downtime or losing data entirely to it's a couple of weeks of downtime.
Okay. Well, one other thing to add to that is that with changes in APIs, especially big changes like what we just saw with Universal Analytics moving to GA4, you also then have the added work of reworking your data model. So you don't necessarily get access to the same continuity of information once they change these platforms. So UA and GA4 is a perfect example of this because their shift away from, the shift to, I should say, events means some of the data that we previously were able to get through APIs from Google is no longer available, or is available in a form now that's so different that making sense of them together is impossible.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, going from like the cookie based, session based system to an event based system. Yeah, I mean, at this point, we're pretty much planning on, reworking or getting as close to the same metrics as we were getting before out of UA. But, at this point, we've told our board of directors, we've told our management team, like, hey, like this is not going to be a one for one because the way Google's doing this now is different. So, really, the important thing in a lot of data sets is making sure that you're getting comparative data and that is directionally correct, right? So especially if you're pulling in data from a third party or an external source, a good example of this would be email service providers who, and Facebook, frankly, is another big offender of this, where if you ask Facebook, if you ask your email service provider, how much of my revenue are you making for me? They will be like 90% of your revenue is coming from me, right? Like everything you're doing on our site is profitable. Like everything you do is leading to positive business outcomes. And we know as business people, like that is not real life. Like that is not true. Like, in a day where I made $90,000, there's no way that I made $150,000 through email. Like it's just not possible. Email service provider. So taking that understanding of like some of these third party sources, I just need directionally correct information that I can compare against itself. Right. So it's like, okay, great. Like they are saying they're making 90% of my revenue. But if I compare revenue period over period, they'll tell me if I'm up or down what percent, right? They're like, hey, your email revenue is up 10%. I believe that my email revenue through their system or their service is up 10%. I don't believe that they're making 90% of my revenue. So that's another big component of this, especially when you're looking at outside data and APIs, especially when it's in someone else's best interest to tell you that they're making all of your money. um, you need to understand that and be like, okay, I understand this data is not perfect data. This is directional data. And I need to look at the percent change between like values and not look at the actual output of data they're giving me.
Yeah, data triangulation. That's the term that I recall. Is find three versions of the same data set or the same information is the best way to say it. Find data that represents three three data representations of the same information. Triangulate using those, and it's pretty hard to go wrong. Well, let's talk about the next steps and where you're going, because a lot of it, I mean, just the amount of dashboards that you have built internally that we've helped and assisted with over the last 3 years since the system has been up, that's remarkable on its own. It that is worthy of a separate conversation just about how you've managed all of that, and especially the Power BI aspects, because I think that you made a very good choice a few years ago when you did your comparison against Tableau and Power BI. At the time, Power BI was not nearly the powerhouse it's become, but they were on track and there was a clear path to that. And for that reason, you opted for a tool that was much lesser known, but that had the two benefits that I've seen. One is that because it's so similar to Excel, and you already mentioned this, it's Power Query. Power Query and Power BI is just Power Query from Excel with added features. Um, Power that familiarity with Excel translates well for people who are not technical people. They can actually do some stuff in Power BI on their own. The second benefit is that because of the Azure Active Directory, it has made governance and user access management a lot cleaner. You don't have separate controls for different parts of the system. The whole system has a consistent set of controls. So I'm going to skip past this because we will probably come back to it with another conversation, and I'm also very interested in more interested, I should say, in what you're doing around predictive modeling, because dashboards are great. That's firmly within that second phase of the data journey. But you're moving firmly into that third and even onto the fourth, where some of it will now become proactive. You're going to put things in place that can make decisions on their own, not just present information to you like model output, which is what you've been doing, but then make decisions downstream from it in real time. And then simulation, the ability to start to do what if comparisons, to bring in things to look at how the brand is going to be, how the brands are going to perform in the coming 12, 24 months. And you're using macroeconomic data for a fair portion of this, which is back to, again, where our paths cross was in the economics department at the University of Utah. And the simulation modeling is the frontier of data science. So we talked about it was big data, then it was machine learning, then it was AI, then generative AI. The next thing I'm predicting will be simulation. I'm already seeing this. I've had a few conversations with other data scientists that I've been in contact with for years, and they're starting to mention it. I was introduced to this very early on because economists were doing this because they'd hit the limits of econometrics. When you don't have historical data sets to use mathematical approaches on, you're forced into the realm of simulation. But you do not have to simulate based on random guesses. You can use data sources. And this is where you have been very clever. And I don't know if you want to give away your secret, so I'm not going to say where you're getting this macroeconomic data. I will just say that you did some due diligence. You found that there is a wide world of available macroeconomic data at the international level, at the national level, at the state level, and even at the municipal and local level. And those metrics can be brought into your environment, blended with your data, your proprietary data, and it's allowing you to forecast. And I'll leave it that vague, and you can fill it in with as much detail as you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem giving away the source because it's free, it's out there. It's the Federal Reserve of Economic Data. They have probably the easiest API that I've ever worked with in my whole life. You basically just say, "Hey, I'd like to access your data," and they give you a key, and then there's already preset modules in Python and R, whatever language you want to use. They already have preset modules for it, and it's literally plug and play. And then you just pick whatever data set you want to look at. The skill of using the macroeconomic data is that you are going to have to spend a lot of time going through and doing correlations and other just regular statistical due diligence to make sure that the macroeconomic data you're looking at is relevant to your business. So an example of that for us, because we are in crafts, is that we are partially countercyclical, right? So any like major depression, obviously we're going to get hit. Any black swan event, we're going to get hit. But for the most part, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing, but if we see a slight increase in unemployment, we see a slight increase in sales. Like our revenue goes up relative to unemployment, and part of that is just people at home being available to do their hobbies. So I'm not saying it again. I'm not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but for us, right, like that's a factor that we can take that is going to, correlate at 60% or higher with our businesses. Um, that we're like, okay, so like this is something we've done the statistical due diligence on it. We know that this correlates with what we do and what we've done historically. So now I can take that information and blend it in, different types of modeling. Right now, we're primarily using ARIMA modeling with the macroeconomic data. So taking the history of the macroeconomic data, blending it in an ARIMA model with our in-house data, and then producing, something that's going to give us a prediction of the future. And my biggest thing with this, and like you're saying, right, like we're just stepping into this phase. And over the last 4 years, we've been cleaning up data and doing data diligence and all that stuff, doing the prescriptive stuff and just the descriptive stuff primarily. So now we're just really stepping into this. But my best advice I would give around moving into some sort of algorithm or algorithmic approach, whatever you want to call it, machine learning, AI, etc., is picking out specific business problems that would be able to be fixed if you had future data available to you. So the specific example that really got us started with this that has been extremely successful is, our buyers historically have not looked at like how much cash we're going to have on hand in the future, right? So we built this model that looks out over the next 12 months and says, okay, here's how much cash you have available for buying inventory in future months. And so we can now sit down with our buyers and they now have a report where they can look into the future and say, am I bringing in too much stuff in September? And it's like, yeah, if, and these are just made up numbers, but, it's like, okay, if we're going to bring in, only $10,000 in cash, we probably shouldn't order $17 million in inventory. Like that's just not going to work. And so being able to, address a specific problem and say, would this problem be solved if I knew the future state of this number? If the answer is yes, then you have a candidate for something where you want to do predictive modeling, you want to do some advanced modeling and analysis on. Um, and again, all this is going to be directionally correct. It does not mean that you're going to be accurate every time. But over the course of the last year that we've been running this, we are accurate within 2%. So I'm fine if my cash is 2% different. I'm not fine if it's 100% different, right? So, you have tolerances, you have specific use cases that you need, and you really need to engage it in a way that is going to be beneficial to solving problems for your organization. What I would not do is I would not tell anyone to hire a bunch of data scientists to start building predictive models on everything, because it doesn't make sense to build predictive models on everything, and it defeats being able to have flexibility. If you rely purely on data and these models, it will remove your ability to be flexible in the future. So you also want to avoid a state where you're like, no, this is the prediction, this is how it's going to happen, I believe it firmly. Then a black swan event happens and your modeling cannot adjust on the fly. You still need a human element to be able to step in and say, hey, this model is not correct. Or, hey, we're running a special promotion, that's why we're buying 2x inventory. And then we're gonna be saving up cash in the prior months to pay for that, whatever it might be. So you still need the flexibility, and you still need to have distinct business problems being solved by this. It's not a catch-all magic thing where you just plug in AI to your data and all of a sudden you know how your business should run.
So what I got from that was starting with simple solutions is a good place.
Absolutely. Just
People might
specific
not know.
problems.
Let me back up real fast because we skipped past this without explaining it. ARIMA modeling is a form of time series econometrics, and it is an advanced method of statistical analysis. It is not an advanced method of algorithms. There are far more advanced algorithms that will also deal with time series data than ARIMA. So the fact that you used ARIMA, it's equivalent like for the comparison that some people may be more familiar with is machine learning models versus something like a OLS regression. And there's a lot of pressure, especially among new data scientists, to go master these most cutting edge methods and apply them to every single problem. And it's not all the time. It seems like it's about 50-50, but when we benchmark different algorithms, when we actually go through that process to test them, the simple algorithms usually perform just as well. They're easier to program. They don't require nearly the technical skill. They don't require nearly the data prep and massaging. You can use more simplistic and smaller data sets. They have a lot of advantages, but because they aren't the cutting edge thing, everyone wants the cutting edge thing. And it's, well, you don't need the cutting edge thing. You just need something that's accurate and over a 12-month period. Now, if you've got the data to justify advanced models, they will start to outperform. We've also been in those situations where it's very clear that a deep learning model will outperform even an ARIMA model, or it's any kind of categorizational prediction. But simple solutions tend to scale better. Let me end with this last question because I've kept you late and I appreciate the extra time. Do you agree with the statement? This was a leading question. I realized that after I put it in the slides, like, how else can this not be leading? Does variety matter more than velocity or volume? Keeping in mind that we're also not talking about veracity and what's the other one? Velocity. No, velocity is up there. Variety, velocity, volume, value, and veracity. That's right. I've only compared variety to velocity and volume because, again, back to the idea of data, complex models require high volume of data and they require it often. So large data sets constantly being fed to the model, you're using something that's benchmarked by the government on a month-by-month basis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you're using monthly data to predict 12 months out. So you have 12 observations, 24 observations historically to do 12 observations in the future. Or with ARIMA, you're supposed to do 50 in the past to do some in the future. But it's
So we're doing, yeah, I mean, we're doing well over 50. I mean, because some of these data sets, um, the trick with these data sets, you have to make sure the definition hasn't changed. Because there are times where they'll update, like just looking at unemployment is not the greatest because the government always changes what unemployment, how they calculate unemployment to make them look a little bit better. What is true unemployment is a debate amongst economists frequently all the time. What does true unemployment look like? But you know, look at these data sets historically. I mean, you can get some of these data sets going all the way back to the 80s. So I mean, you're looking at, years and years and years, decades of data that's going into that side of the, that's going to that side of the model.
But from a volume standpoint, it's not very much. From a velocity standpoint, updating monthly is not that often.
Mm-hmm.
Why has this worked for you? And again, I even underlined the word variety to bias you because I think it is the fact that you are using a metric, a data point that is not being utilized outside of academia for almost anything. Very few businesses are using any of this data. It goes down to sector level detail in some places. And I've worked with some data sets that go back into the 60s and 50s. But you're right, changing definitions matter. So I propose a question again, does variety matter more than velocity and volume?
I
I'm
think they have.
I'm not trying to force you.
I think they all have their place, right? I mean, it depends, right? Because I guess that there's two parts to this, right? So one is kind of like the rhythm, like how often do you need to be reporting on this data, right? Like, is this something you need to be running daily? And like my question is, if you're running anything daily, like you better have a very specific use case if you need daily predictions on how you're operating. but that's an aside. That's maybe a business topic that can be debated. But um, yes, I think there's two sides, right? Like it does matter on, not just the variety, but the other stuff matters based on like what you're trying to achieve. But I think what matters more in that regard is like how frequently you need to be reporting. And if it's, monthly, then it's going to be less critical than the quality and variety of data that you're putting in there. So for me, it's less of like what's more important, and for me, it's more of like what's the context of importance, and making sure that you're meeting the requirement for what you're trying to do. So if I'm trying to get monthly data, the velocity and size of the data, it's less important, but it is still extremely important up to a point, right? Up to a point that I'm still making sure that I can have the right amount of data, um, and the right timing of data, et cetera, to make sure that my modeling works. That's important. On the flip side, you're absolutely right. In terms of like, how do I get accuracy of my business against what's going on globally or what's going on, in macroeconomics? Then the variety does matter. And that goes back to my point of like, make sure you're doing your statistical due diligence on what you're looking at. And that's where sometimes too, it helps to look at what economists refer to as leading metrics, right? Like leading data sets, like this leads this. So like a decline in home sales leads to a decline in furniture sales, but it's not immediate, right? Because the people that are currently buying their homes are still buying furniture at the same rate. So, right, like that's a good example if you were in that industry. So you would say, okay, so a leading metric, if I'm selling furniture, a leading metric for me, I'm going to look at home sales. And if my home sales dip drastically in this month, then I would expect my revenue and total sales to drop in the following month after that. So that's where doing that due diligence, looking at the variety of data, what are your leading metrics, that are out there that lead your industry, that lead your business, but not immediately make changes to it. That's going to be the most valuable data, because if you have a leading metric, it gives you time to come up with a plan or make an adjustment before you're hit with the decline in revenue or the decline in sales. And then you can make an adjustment against that.
Very cool. Well, Ben, thank you so much for the time that you give me today. I've taken quite a bit extra, so I appreciate you being patient and sharing so much detail about what you've done. I would love to talk to you again another time about the dashboard management. I think that by itself is just an amazing story, both the rapid growth, but the effectiveness of those dashboards in their individual use cases. You've really mastered the ability to get in there with a data audit, to figure out what data is needed, how they want to use data moving forward, and then build them a prototype through iterative processes that then very quickly get stood up and put in production. So I'll definitely want to have you back for that. Appreciate the time.
Sounds good. Thank you, Luciano.
See ya.
Bye.